Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles, and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 10th of February 1924, the Times looks back at the life of Woodrow Wilson. But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. Mr. Gandhi, as the Times calls him, has been ordered to be released from prison in India on the grounds of ill health. The Prince of Wales has been thrown by his horse and broken his collarbone. He is not the only member of the royal family to have been thrown by his horse. Much the same happened to the king during the war while inspecting troops in France. He ended up with a broken pelvis. A chap called Rykov has become Prime Minister of the Soviet Union. So he's the big cheese, yes? Not exactly, as the Times explains. The real political decisions on inner and exterior policy are now made more than ever in the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In other Soviet news, there have been claims that the Soviet Union has been attempting to destabilize the government of Estonia using the local Communist Party. Russians destabilizing their neighbours, eh? Where have I heard that before? I saw this in the edition dated Wednesday the 6th of February. The retail prices per gallon of national benzol and national benzol mixture have been increased to 2 shillings 3 pence and 1 shilling 11 pence respectively, 2 shillings 4 pence and 2 shillings in Scotland, to conform with the recently increased price of petrol. As I understand it, benzol is a product made from coal tar, and is used as a substitute for petrol, or motor spirit as it is sometimes called at this time. Benzol mixture has some petrol added. Given that the mixture is cheaper, I can only imagine that benzol is a better fuel in some way. Anyway, as regular listeners will know, I'm always interested in how prices then compare with prices today, so here goes. So 1 shilling 11 pence is 23 pence, which is approximately 1/10 of a pound, which is approximately 1/50th of a troy ounce of gold. Now, in today's money, that would be £32, but you have to apply the Crozier fudge factor, which accounts for the overvaluation of the pound in 1924. So that brings us brings us down to about £16 per gallon, per British gallon that is, which, according to my calculations, is about £3.51 per litre. Which means that in Britain at least, petrol, even if you include all the taxes, is a lot cheaper than it was in 1924. I don't know what the tax situation was then, but given I am yet to read any complaints about it, I would guess it was pretty low. As were London's buildings in those days. A Delisa Joseph is not happy. This is from Monday the 4th of February. The commercial development of London, and with it the commercial and industrial development of the country, cannot be held back by restrictions which at present limit the height of buildings to dimensions fixed 30 years ago, since which time a complete change has been brought about in fire-resisting construction and in the methods of fire attack. So there is a height limit in place. That would explain a lot, and also that it's a fire safety issue. Obviously those devil-may-care Americans aren't so bothered. It does make you wonder what changes have been made that make buildings more fire-resistant. Removing wood, I suppose. Fire doors, fire escapes, fire alarms, perhaps. When it comes to methods of fire attack other than extinguishers and sprinklers, were they even a thing 100 years ago, I'm a bit stumped. A year or so ago, the Times published an article, see the end screen, on Vienna, Austria, which was then experiencing hyperinflation. This week, the Times has published another article on Vienna. The hyperinflation has gone, and according to the correspondent, things are looking a lot better. He makes no mention of unemployment or businesses going bust as a consequence. He does make mention of the importance to Viennese business of the Jewish community. The correspondent regards it as a good thing. I think we can take it as read that not everyone, unfortunately, agrees. There are other forms of progress. This is from Tuesday the 5th of February. Selected by a prisoner for his defence yesterday, Mrs. Nermanston was the first woman barrister to appear as counsel in a trial at the Central Criminal Court. The Times is wrong here. Her surname is Normanton, and that is her maiden name, although she is married. I wonder how she'll be spending her spare time. Somehow I doubt it'll involve sitting down with anything published by Mills and Boon. They had an ad in the Times this week showcasing such titles as Match-Winning Billiards and The Lure of Old Chelsea. No, definitely not suitable for a barrister. It's never great to have to explain a joke, but it occurs to me that there may be some listeners who are unaware that Mills and Boon is nowadays a publisher of escapist fiction for women, as Wikipedia would have it. Another bunch known for their love of escapist fictions was the German High Command. This is from Saturday the 9th. The organ of the Church of Saint-Gervais, Paris, which was damaged during a service on Good Friday 1918 by a shell fired from the German gun known as Big Bertha, which at the same time killed a large number of the congregation, has now been restored, and its return to use was celebrated by a special ceremony yesterday. Well, first of all, and apologies for the pedantry, but it wasn't a Big Bertha. Big Bertha was a siege mortar. The weapon that the article is referring to was the Paris gun. Although technically impressive, it consumed huge resources and achieved very little. As mentioned earlier, this week brought the news that Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States from 1913 to 1921, had died. The Times reflected on his life in an editorial. One of the three dominating figures of the world's greatest peace conference, that's Versailles in case you're wondering, passed away yesterday, a forlorn invalid, politically negligible, just 5 years after the moment of his greatest triumph. Wilson had had a stroke in late 1919 which crippled him. He did not resign. The dizziness of the height to which he rose and the completeness of his collapse, the enthusiasm of his followers and the scorn of his opponents, the popularity and esteem of millions which were his in 1918-1919, the oblivion that shrouded the last years of his life, make it as yet impossible to estimate his true place in history. A forlorn invalid, politically negligible. Is this really the time to mention that? Surely this is the time when we look at what he did when he was at the height of his powers. The Times didn't even do this when Lenin, who had been similarly invalided, died the other week. And by the way, it doesn't make it impossible to estimate his true place in history. What makes that impossible is the proximity of events. Washington at all times provides the political stage with the best sounding board, and at the close of hostilities, America's position was unique. She had entered the war with decisive effect. Of all armies in the field, hers was the least disinclined to continue the fight. At home, her resources had not even begun to approach the point of exhaustion. I would take issue with the idea that America's entry into the war was decisive. But they're quite right about wanting to continue the fight. Many American units continued to attack right up to 11 o'clock on Armistice Day. Trained by his profession of lecturer to expound his views lucidly and succinctly, he embodied the objects of the war in phrases that literally went the round of the world, and filled even his enemies with hope. I wonder if that's a sly dig. The Germans after the armistice were hopeful they would get a peace similar to the terms outlined in Wilson's famous 14 points. Referring to his proposals, the Times says, "They also contained the provision that all international agreements and treaties of every kind should be made known in their entirety to the rest of the world. Since in the subsequent welter of his negotiations many of his projects foundered, let it be recorded at once that this declaration of the President's became finally embodied in the Covenant of the League, and that thus President Wilson may claim to have accomplished more for open diplomacy than any other single man. International treaties are now not valid unless they have been registered at the headquarters of the League." Whatever a valid treaty is, that is. Of course, we are assuming that open diplomacy is a good thing. I'm guessing probably. The sinking civilization of Europe clutched at the aphorisms of President Wilson as drowning men to a plank. There was hardly a town among the peoples of Europe living south and east of Germany that did not name a street or a public building after this spokesman of their highest aspirations. This is because he advocated self-determination, the idea that borders should be determined by votes, not wars, a principle which oddly enough the Times does not refer to by name. When the conference met in Paris, he was elected its chairman, and at first enjoyed the preeminence which his position as head of a state gained for him. He was responsible for getting the Covenant of the League incorporated in the peace treaties. But, having achieved this success, he made the tactical error of leaving Paris for a short visit to Washington. He failed to restore his position there, and he'd lost his position in Paris. I wonder if that's true. The article then talks about his dislike of going places and meeting people. His admirers gradually realized that he was an idealist without enthusiasm, a friend of the human race who had a curious dislike for human intercourse. It's known as being an introvert. Moreover, he had necessarily to compromise with his principles on many points, and these defections were used against him with caustic avidity by his political opponents on his return to America. He contributed largely to his own downfall by a complete failure to placate his Republican critics. He never adequately faced the difficulty that the American Constitution raised by making him share his treaty-making rights with the Senate. He took with him to Paris none of his political opposition. His advisers whom he took he seldom consulted. He trusted nobody but himself, and ended by representing nobody but himself. He seemed to hold that he personally could translate into action the aspirations which were common to the best minds of all countries. But, besides being deficient in diplomatic technique, he was ignorant of Europe. Like many other Americans, he judged the European temperament chiefly from the numerous communities settled in the United States, but whose outlook becomes greatly enlarged and modified by the greater horizon of their new surroundings. How can an outlook become enlarged? And how might it be modified? Do they mean that, for example, Irish Americans were constantly clamouring for Irish independence, and that he assumed that clamouring represented Irish feelings? But the first part of that paragraph, the bit about listening to people and forging coalitions, is something that any politician should bear in mind. Yet with all his faults, he was a great American, who played for a brief space a greater part in the world's affairs than any of his long line of predecessors. He may not ultimately be reckoned among her greatest statesmen. He was rather a famous professor of politics, who for a while had the world as classroom. Of course, since 1940, presidents of America have been ex officio presidents of the world. The Times also published an article they described as a memoir. For a brief period, he occupied by popular acclaim a position of such greatness as has perhaps never been attained by any other living man. By the Federal Reserve banking law, he introduced a system for facilitating credit throughout the country and taking the control of money out of the hands of a few large concerns in the East, thus removing the danger of such financial panics as had been experienced in the past with such disastrous effect to the nation's trade. Words that have not aged well. The editorial states that at the time it was too early to assess Wilson. No, it doesn't. I said that. Oh, never mind. Anyway, it was too early. But it's not too early for us, or me, so let's give it a go. The thing that jumps out of you is the failure of the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations. There is this idea that international disputes can be resolved by similar means to domestic disputes. But the situations are fundamentally different. Typically, the state is far more powerful than any individual, but an international body is rarely vastly more powerful than an individual state. Certainly not in the sense that it can easily apply force to a non-complying state. When it comes to self-determination, well, that is what most borders in Europe reflect. At least they do now. There has been a fair amount of population transfer over the years. So 50% successful so far. Of course, the elephant in the room is the fact of the Second World War. Had Wilson been successful in getting Congress to ratify the treaty, would that have prevented the war? I doubt it. Portentous words on pieces of paper ultimately rely on the willingness of people to fight for them. Even the British didn't want to fight by the 1930s, so what chance the Americans? The Germans, on the other hand, were prepared to fight, and as if to prove the point, managed to cause a diplomatic incident when their embassy in Washington failed to lower its flag to half-mast on hearing the news of Wilson's death. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.